preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is John Ruskay. I'm the Director of Education here at the Y, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, and let me also just apologize for this delay. We tried to accommodate everyone that was here, and I think we have, and I really want to thank you and apologize for any inconvenience, particularly for those of you that happened to come on time. I want to welcome you to the opening evening of the retribalization of the Jews, this four-part series jointly sponsored by the 92nd Street Y and the Radius Institute. Several quick announcements of forthcoming Jewish omnibus events. Tomorrow evening, Professor Stephen Cohn concludes his four-part series, which is titled Challenges to Peace in the Middle East. The subject of tomorrow evening's lecture is Breaking the Cycle, Peace through Development. He will deliver that at 8 o'clock. And on Thursday evening, Dr. Eric Goldman of the Jewish Media Service launches a four-part series entitled American Jewry Through the Cinematic Lens. Finally, we launched this Sunday a new component of Jewish Omnibus, all-day institutes, which provide an opportunity for all of us to study with some of the extraordinary teachers and major thinkers in the community. Conducting this Sunday's institute, this Sunday, January 16, from 9:30 to 5, will be one of our participants this evening, Yitz Greenberg. His subject, quote, Toward a Jewish Sexual Ethic. The institute begins at 9:30 and is scheduled to conclude at 5, and one can register for the institute and the others, which will be conducted by Zalman Schachter, Art Green, and Yitzchak Yitzchaki in a number of other Sundays in the Education Department office. During the past 3 years in the winter, the Y and the Radius Institute have joined forces and jointly presented what we believe are high-quality series on central issues facing the community. Last year, we provided an opportunity for a serious analysis of the new Jewish culture. This year, we focus on the subject of ethnicity and the tension between particularism and universalism as manifest both throughout history and today. Following the program this evening, the audience is invited to join with the speakers in the lounge at the rear of the hall for some coffee and an opportunity to spend some time together. To introduce our speakers, I am pleased to call upon the director of the Radius Institute, a colleague and a dear friend of mine, and I know many of yours, Steve Shaw.
My relatives are in the audience. It's particularly wonderful to see how many people are here today. It's nice to be able to turn away friends and relatives. Tonight's series has three distinguished people on the panel. I think that those of us who've read John Murray Cuddihy's Ordeal of Civility, or No Offense, Civil Religion, Protestant Taste, know that we have a worthy critic among us. Many of us complain about the sorry state of Jewish journalism. Some of the Jewish weeklies we find hard to take. They really embody a new turn inward. John Murray Cuddihy reads everything. Those things which I myself am embarrassed to read, John Murray Cuddihy does a sociology of. And if anyone has really examined the Jewish people with all our wonderful qualities and all our problematic traits, it's Jack Cuddihy. So we're pleased to have him in dialogue tonight with Irving Greenberg, a person who's lived in a certain sense with dialectic tension of Jewish chosenness. Yitz, who is the director and founder of the National Jewish Resource Center, is both an Orthodox rabbi and Harvard-trained historian. And both Jack Cuddihy and Yitz Greenberg will deal in different ways with the tension between Jewish chosenness, between the basic theme of this series, which is the tension between the universal and particular trends that are indigenous to the Jewish tradition. Moderating this session is a member of the Radius Fellowship, a historian and professor, first at Columbia and now at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and dean of the Seminary College, Paula Hyman.
I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the specific topic of this evening's session, which is the thorny issue of chosenness, a concept which has its roots deep in the very foundation of biblical religion, and one that was developed further within the rabbinic tradition. There's no way that I can set out for you, in the 3 to 5 minutes that were so graciously allotted to me, the theological ramifications of chosenness as an expression of the special covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people. In brief, God and the Jews chose each other, assuming a set of mutual responsibilities with the ultimate purpose of building a holy community on earth. For the Jews, this was an interesting combination of privilege and burden, and the rabbis, it's important to note, recognized the tension that we too sense between universalism and particularism within this formulation. Chosenness played an important function for Jews throughout their history in exile. While the concepts of covenant and ultimate redemption enabled Jews to look to a future that would make the present bearable during the period of exile, the doctrine of chosenness provided a strong measure of psychological compensation for a people who were purposely degraded by Christian and Muslim societies in which they lived. Chosenness, I think, becomes particularly problematic for Jews in the modern period. And if I were to rephrase tonight's topic, how chosen are the Jews, I would twist it and refer to it as how are the Jews chosen? Because this, I think, becomes an issue for Jews in our own time, an issue that has perturbed modern Jewish thinkers for the past 200 years. Certainly those who were made uncomfortable, as many Jews have been, by the very notion of chosenness for a number of different reasons, which I'd like to set out for you. How, after all, could Jews justify a claim to superior status, which seems to be inherent in the notion of chosenness, when they were at the very same time clamoring for equality within society, and later in the late 19th and 20th centuries becoming the primary proponents of pluralism within democratic societies? How at the time of emancipation could Jews justify divine election when they seemed to be not superior, but if anything, inferior, not only in legal status, but also in their cultural achievements? Jewish thinkers did battle with this dilemma through the apologetics of the 19th century by reshaping the concept of chosenness through the mission theory, and by declaring that Jews were meant to become or lagoyim, a light unto the nations of the world, during their period of exile. More importantly, how could Jews justify chosenness once their belief in a choosing God had been eroded in a period of secularization? What was chosenness to mean if the theological underpinnings of chosenness no longer carried weight for the majority of Jews? And finally, how could Jews as a people justify chosenness in the years after the Holocaust, when the consequences of election, divine election, seemed to be so brutal? If Jews in modern times have been troubled by these questions, which I'm sure will be addressed tonight, we have also been, I think, notoriously reluctant, with the exception of Mordechai Kaplan and the Reconstructionist movement, we've been notoriously reluctant to jettison chosenness on the altar of democratic equality. Instead, we've tried to reshape our felt notions of chosenness. For example, chosenness in an ethnic dimension informs that aspect of Zionist thought which sought and still seeks to establish a model society within the state of Israel. And it's worth at least contemplating whether that claim towards establishing a model society is related in any way to the extraordinary level of criticism, one might say a particularly extreme level of criticism which has been leveled at Zionism for its failure to achieve that model society. Does chosenness lie behind the elements of ethnic triumphalism which emerge now in the contemporary American community? Finally, what does chosenness mean to American Jews today, and how is it perceived by other Americans? Our two distinguished speakers this evening, John Murray Cuddihy and Irving Greenberg, will address these and other questions, and I'd like to at least explain to you the format that we will be following. Each of them will speak initially for 20 to 25 minutes. They'll then have a few moments to reply to each other's remarks, and finally, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. Our first speaker, John Murray Cuddihy, is professor of sociology at Hunter College of the City University of New York. He has been a provocative critic of modern Jewish consciousness and ideologies. He is, as you have heard, the author of two well-known books, the first, The Ordeal of Civility, and the second, No Offense, both of which deal with the consequences of a painful Jewish adjustment to modern society. He is currently writing a new book on New York Jewish intellectuals. All of us.
Thank
Professor
you.
Cuddihy.
Thank you, Paula Hyman. Before beginning, don't take this out of my time, Paula. I first want to thank the Radius Institute and Rabbi Steve Shaw and the Y and John Ruskay for inviting me here for this dialogue, debate on Jewish chosenness, an exchange with my friend of some years now from the Holocaust Seminar at CUNY's Graduate Center, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. As a so-called bridge person between the religious and the secular, unaffiliated Jew, perhaps tonight he'll be a Triborough bridge person and include a goy. I'm going to begin, as I begin all my writing, with an epigraph. My wife suggested I not begin with it. I'm beginning with it. In 1967, at the time of the Arab-Israeli War of 67, Charles de Gaulle had a famous press conference in which, in answer to a question, he spoke of the Israelis, the Jews, as un peuple d'élite sûr de lui et dominateur. An elite or elitist people, sûr de lui, self-assured, et dominateur, and domineering. There's been some debate about how to translate it, but this petite phrase of de Gaulle, Le Grand Charles, went all around the world and stirred up a great debate. That's my epigraph for the evening. I presume I was selected for this role in good part because of my second book, No Offense, Civil Religion and Protestant Taste. This book is about the triumphalist cores in the three classical European religions, Judaism, Catholicism, and Protestantism. For Jews, it is the chosen people doctrine. For Catholics, we are the one true church doctrine, as in the formula extra ecclesiam nulla salus est, and the only Jesus saves doctrine of the fundamentalist Protestant sectarians. With the French Enlightenment, with Jewish emancipation, with emigration to America, these three religions are put under pressure to construe their core triumphalisms in a more tempered way, becoming sensitive to just how these claims sound in the ears of the other religions, which are indeed making isomorphic claims of their own. I chose one theologian from each of these religions, Reinhold Niebuhr for the Protestants, the Jesuit, John Courtney Murray for the Catholics, and Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, who was then head of the American Jewish Congress for the Jews, and show how social and cultural pressures enter their theological interpretations even at their core, and of how they gradually begin to experience their large claims to theological superiority as not only somehow wrong, but as vulgar, self-centered, and tasteless. This is the force of the Protestant taste of my title. It's been my experience that the Protestants have only read the Protestant part and complain of my treatment of Niebuhr. The Catholics complain of my treatment of Father Murray, and the Jews of what I have to say about Rabbi Hertzberg. Santayana used to speak of normal madness. Likewise, to center the world on oneself, to be egocentric or ethnocentric or family-centered, like the German Jewish Familiengefühl, or class-centered, class superiority, or nation-centered, as in extreme patriotism or chauvinism, my country right or wrong. Most all people and groups have a touch, and more than a touch, of this. Toynbee coined a word from the Latin word for us, usism. He called it nocism. Think of the Irish Sinn Féin, us alone. Ideas have consequences. Tonight I will indicate certain consequences of the idea of the chosen people. Some of these will be ordinary, vulgar consequences. Sociologists are interested in vulgar as well as in refined consequences. The Hebrew language, Arnold Eisen reminds us, knows no phrase, the chosen people. It knows only the active tense. God chose, loved, called Israel. Recently, there has been a new translation under the direction of H.L. Ginsberg of the Jewish Theological Seminary of the Bible, and the Shema, the famous invocation, the Shema Israel of Deuteronomy, was formerly rendered as, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Now it is translated, they claim more correctly, as, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." Chosenness is what Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg calls an affirmation. He declares, quote, "The essence of Judaism is the affirmation that the Jews are the chosen people. All else is commentary." Tonight, I'll give a commentary. A short one. You'll find a longer one in my book, no offense, sold for only $5 as you go out at the door. My commentary will indicate some of the dysfunctional or bad consequences of this affirmation. Many of them are unintended, even unwanted consequences, but nevertheless, I think, expectable consequences. I presume that Yitz will take care of the good consequences of the idea of chosenness. It has consequences for secular and religious Jews, for Jewish writing, for Jewish politics, for Jewish discussion of the Holocaust. Take Brooklyn's ex-district attorney Eugene Gold. When his term of office ended recently, he and his wife Ronnie went on Aliyah to Israel. A reporter for Jewish Week newspaper caught up with them in early August last summer in a cafe in the Jewish Quarter. I read from this news item. A reporter ran across a familiar face and familiar Brooklyn accent in the Jewish Quarter of the old city of Jerusalem and asked Eugene Gold, new immigrant, how he liked it in Israel and how Israel compared with America. That was an unfair question, the former DA of Kings County said. It's unfair to compare Israel with America. Materially, there's no land like the States. But that's not what we came here for anyway, he said over a glass of wine with a reporter for Israel Seen, the slick magazine of the World Zionist Organization. Asked why he went on Aliyah? Sure, he said. In New York, we had a much higher standard of living, but we wanted to be part of a state that reflects the uniqueness of being Jewish, the morals, the justice. He looked at his wife, Ronnie. Well, didn't he? He asked her. She beamed assent. That's a consequence, with a lot of intervening variables, I think, of the doctrine of chosenness. America comes off as materialistic. Israel comes off as uniquely moral and just. Shortly after the Lebanese massacre, David K. Shipler for The Times interviews Rabbi Alexander M. Schindler, leader of the Reform movement, after he spoke with Prime Minister Begin, and there was a lot of anguish going on at that time. Rabbi Schindler asked, and I quote from The Times, "What has given us, historically, the strength to withstand the attacks of the world?" By the attacks, he meant the criticisms of Israel for what it had done or neglected to do. Our sense of rightness, the only thing that has enabled us to withstand the torments of the centuries, the martyrdom, was our sense of moral superiority. End quote. That's another place, so to speak, another secularization of the theological idea of chosenness. It goes into a sense or feeling of moral superiority. The late Robert Warshaw writing of the urban Jewish male character in playwright Clifford Odetz's plays, he is thinking of Awake and Sing, observes that he could create in the minds of his children, quote, only an entirely generalized ideal of moral and intellectual superiority, absolutely without content. He adds that often in the play, his children could never quite see from what he derived his superiority. It derives, at least in part, I would contend, from secularized residues of the chosen-ness doctrine. Another consequence of the chosen-ness conviction is what may be called, in Henry Feingold's term, the illusion of centrality. This is a secularization of the centrality posited by classical religious chosen-ness. As Leon Wieseltier writes of the influence of the image of election or chosen-ness on Jews, quote, what distinguished the Jews from other immigrants then was their image of themselves, however morbid or self-elected that was. They differed in believing that they differed. Indeed, he continues, no historian who fails to deal with the deeply ingrained self-image of the Jews will ever understand them. Jewishness has always been a form of consciousness. The conviction that the Jew was at world history's center, the unique agent or victim of its design, the absolute significance which Jews had in Europe attached to their fate was not possible in America, in a pluralistic situation for which they can no longer claim, even to themselves, that they are intrinsically at America's center. End quote. Now, this isn't the one among many demeanor American pluralism urges upon its many religions. Sometimes the claim is to being at the center, as opposed to the periphery, the margin. Sometimes the schema of the claim is a vertical claim to superiority, the implication being the others are somehow below or inferior. Another consequence is the way it can affect the consciousness and tone of some Jewish novelists, what I call the assumption of exemplariness. Eric Korn, in the London Times Literary Supplement, TLS, criticizes in certain stories of Leonard Michaels the tone of, quote, certainty that the agonies of middle-class New York Jews are somehow exemplary for the suffering world, end quote. Korn is not denying the right of any group to being exemplary for others under certain circumstances, but to the artistically unearned, easy certainty of assumption that they are. This assumption he finds presumptuous. Another consequence, this one that preserves the separatism of the Jews, that retards the assimilation of the Jews to other groups. Marshall Sklar, the noted sociologist of religion, who taught many years at Brandeis and authored the best sociological study of conservative Judaism, observed in 1955 that Jews, and I quote, still possess a feeling of superiority, although more in the moral and intellectual realms now than in the area of spiritual affairs. While the Jewish feeling of superiority is a factor which has received comparatively little attention from the students of the problem of explaining Jewish survival, it is of crucial importance because it operates to retard assimilation. Leaving the group is viewed not as an advancement, but as cutting oneself off from a claim to superiority, end quote. I'm sure Rabbi Greenberg will approve of it precisely because it retards assimilation. But what if one should?
Speak for yourself, John.
Okay. But what if one should, quote, cut oneself off from this claim to superiority by apostasy? What happens? The Jew departing Jewish identity for another religious identity is charged with self-hate. What seems like a description of a psychological state, self-hate, is really functioning as a means of community control. The Jew departing his group maybe likes another group or another religion, or maybe has an aversion to the one he was born in. But he or she is carefully taught that what's really going on in apostasy is self-hate, Selbsthass. After a while, the defector agrees and sometimes returns. Situations defined as real are real in their consequences, as W.I. Thomas said. Self-hate is part of the chosen people complex of ideas. If Jewishness is a state of being, something you are rather than something you voluntarily believe in, it is but a short step to define as hatred of yourself what may in fact be dislike or disagreement with Jewish values, beliefs, and traditions. It functions in this sense like Marx's false consciousness or like Freud's resistance. It is objectively true. Of course, the group gets angry at those who leave. All religions, all peoples get mad and feel betrayed by those who leave them. But it's only the Jewish group that coins a psychobabble term like self-hate with which to punish its defectors. To me, it's so much more accurate and humane to say to defecting Jews, either A, we hate you, or B, you hate us. But not that locution, you hate yourself. Self-hate isn't an idea. Self-hate is a psychologically manipulative epithet. It demeans those who use it. It is an attempt at social control disguised as an empirical description of a psychological state. It should be permanently retired from use. See, by the way, the magnificent essay by Oscar Mandel, Being and Judaism, in the fall 1982 issue of the Georgia Review. Perhaps the major use to which the doctrine of chosenness has been put is to bring comfort in times of trouble, as Paula Hyman mentioned, especially in the Emancipation period and at the time of the destruction of the temple. It provides some sort of answer to Jews for the problem of evil. This function of the chosen people affirmation, theologians call it the theodicy function, became more necessary, paradoxically, after Jewry was emancipated into the West. In the pre-emancipation era, when Jews lived in a more or less separate society with its own quasi-political structure, the Kehillah, Judaism's conviction of its religious superiority could continue relatively undisturbed in its medieval, unself-conscious condition. But occasionally, the West broke into the shtetl, not only in the form of Cossacks and pogroms, but in the theologically even more disturbing form of princes and princesses. And then the chosen people doctrine was really put under pressure. Let me explain what I mean. Solomon Maimon, born in 1754 in Nieuwisz in Poland in the 18th century, supplies precious documentary testimony as to how the chosen people doctrine functioned in a family setting on the eve of emancipation. In his autobiography, he recalls an incident from his boyhood in a Polish shtetl. I am reading now from my book, The Ordeal of Civility, pages 146, 147. One day, Prince Radziwill, a great lover of the chase, came with his daughter, Princess Radziwill, and his whole court to hunt in Maimon's neighborhood. This prince, by the way, is the ancestor of Stanislaus Radziwill, who married Jackie Kennedy's sister Lee, and is Lee Radziwill. So we're among very high company this evening. The young princess, needing rest, came with the ladies and servants of her court to this very room, Maimon writes in his celebrated autobiography, where as a boy I was sitting behind the stove. I was struck with astonishment at the magnificence and splendor of the court. I could not satisfy my eyes with the sight. My father came in just as I was beside myself with joy and had broken into the words, "Oh, how beautiful." In order to calm me and at the same time to confirm me in the principles of our faith, he whispered into my ear, "Little fool, in the other world the duxel will kindle the pesur for us," which means in the future life the princess will kindle the stove for us. No one can conceive the sort of feeling this statement produced in me, recalls Maimon, supplying precious testimony on the waning of the Jewish Middle Ages. On the one hand, I believed my father and was very glad about the future happiness in store for us. On the other hand, I could not get it into my head that this beautiful rich princess in this splendid dress could ever make a fire for a poor Jew. I was thrown into the greatest complexity on the subject. Here we can observe the chosenness conviction in action. Note several things about this passage. First, the twofold function of his father's reminder of the messianic destiny to come. It was a double reassurance, both psychological and theological. Papa Maimon whispered what he did to little Solomon in order, quote, to calm me, and at the same time to confirm me in the principles of our faith. After emancipation, when the religious reassurance evaporates, the psychological confidence remains. 2, note secondly, how chosenness takes reverses and then reverses them in turn. In the world to come, the princess will kindle our stove, not we hers. In my ordeal of civility, I show how this messianic reversal is turned into that secular reversal we call revolution in the 19th century. Intellectual Jews like Marx and Hess no longer wait passively for the end like Maimon's father, but as secularists, they force the end, using communism and Zionism as mobilizing ideologies. Note third, how Solomon's father invokes the dark side of the chosenness doctrine. He doesn't say, as many Negro spirituals do, that come the Messiah, we'll all be princes and princesses and sitting pretty. Instead, he strikes the theme of retribution. The Gentiles will be our bondservants then. This is the zero-sum or shadow side of the messianic reversal, as it functioned frequently in the consciousness of Jews. In fact, it was one of Jesus' breaks with the Torah, one of the scandals of Jesus, that early in his ministry, as we read in Luke chapter 4, he went into the synagogue in Nazareth on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And when they had delivered to him the book of the prophet Isaiah, Jesus proceeded to read from Isaiah 61:1 on the remarkable things that will come to pass at the day of salvation. The famous passage ending, "He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to captives, and recovering the sight of the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." This is from Luke 4. But Jesus here breaks off in mid-sentence. The conclusion and the day of the vengeance of our God is missing, as Joachim Jeremias notes. Jesus criticizes the Torah primarily by omitting elements of it, he observes. The people of Nazareth are shocked, scandalized, that Jesus quotes only the words of grace from Isaiah 61 to preach about and omits the mention of vengeance, although it also occurred in the text. In the passage in Matthew 11, Jesus also passes over the eschatological vengeance on the Gentiles, although it is announced in all three Old Testament passages which he takes up, Isaiah 35, Isaiah 29, Isaiah 61. This is an omission. This was so much in the consciousness of people of the period, it's like his stopping in the... Everyone waited for the dun-dun at the end, and it just didn't come. So it was a noticeable omission. Note finally about this passage from Maimon that the chosen people affirmation highlights the double function of the evil it, as a theodicy explains. Namely, it explains both why we Jews are so far down and why the Goyim are riding so high. Long ago, Max Weber pointed out that theodicies explain both poverty and prosperity, both deprivation and privilege. The chosenness doctrine, with its long-awaited messianic reversal, explains not only why bad things happen to good people, as in the title of Rabbi Kushner?
Yes.
Rabbi Kushner's bestseller, who was here on the Y about 3 weeks ago, but the perhaps even more painful spectacle of good things happening to bad people, to the unchosen, to the Goyim. Now, one more influence on Holocaust interpretation, and then I will conclude with a reference to Yitz. In early June of 1974, a Jewish and Christian symposium on Auschwitz was held at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York City. 18 days later, by the way, at which conference my colleague here, Yitz Greenberg, was one of the participants and wrote a very moving paper, which I'll refer to at the very end. 18 days later, there appeared on the op-ed page of the New York Times an essay by the novelist William Styron, who since has written, as you know, Sophie's Choice. in which he protested the symposium's overwhelming emphasis on anti-Semitism and Christian guilt, noting that over 1 million Christian Slavs were murdered in the same way as the Jews in the same place. He concluded, "I cannot accept anti-Semitism as the sole touchstone by which we examine the monstrous paradigm that Auschwitz has become. To place all the blame on Christian theology is to ignore the complex secular roots of anti-Semitism as well. If the Holocaust was anti-Semitic," he ends, "it was also anti-Christian, it was anti-human, anti-life." Styron's reaction to the Auschwitz Symposium, provoked in turn the notoriously indignant and astonishing counterattack by Cynthia Ozick, A Liberal's Auschwitz. It appeared in a quarterly, appropriately titled Confrontation. In this reply of Ozick, defending the uniqueness of the Holocaust, Fackenheim's, well, excuse me, I did. Yes, on this, Yes, the Jews, Ozick reports to Styron, were not an instance of Nazi slaughter. They were the purpose and whole reason for it. Like any successful factory in roaring production, she adds, the German death factory produced useful byproducts, the elimination of Slavs and most gypsies. On this, then, the Ozickian hermeneutic of the Holocaust, Christian Slavs and most gypsies are indeed de facto victims, but they fail of achieving what I have elsewhere called accredited victim status. They fail to achieve it because, being an ascriptive status, it cannot be achieved. For Miss Ozick, these non-Jewish victims are dead, all right, but dead for all the wrong reasons. Incidentally dead, mere byproducts of the Holocaust, as she calls them in her revealing metaphor. What could have allowed so careful and anti-metaphoric a writer as Cynthia Ozick to lapse into her ghastly figure of speech? We find a clue in Kenneth Burke, who writes, "It is such gratuitous or somewhat irrelevant metaphors that we consider particularly revealing, for they break through or intrude upon the subject matter at hand, and we believe that this power to intrude, to force themselves into expression, is supplied by constants of preoccupation broader than the subject of the moment. The constant which is preoccupying Cynthia Ozick is, I suggest, the negatively defined residual category, non-Jew, which is another consequence of the chosen-ness doctrine." In conclusion, I'd like to mention here Yitz Greenberg's forced option interpretation of chosen-ness, as he puts it in his moving paper, Cloud of Smoke, Pillar of Fire, at the Cathedral Holocaust Symposium some years ago, maybe 9 years ago now. Jews, observant or secular, were murdered in Hitler's Holocaust. Even involuntarily, they testified to their identity as Jews. Their mere existence was a kind of witness. This testimony on Greenberg's reading he would construe as the secret significance of the ancient Christian phrase describing pre-Christian Judaism as Israel of the flesh, Israel carnaliter. He urges Christians so to define themselves in the future, say, as a people like the Jews, that they give hostages to fortune, to define themselves in such a way, on the analogy with Jews, that there will be no more possibility of an out in a time of evil, no slipping into the identity of a mere Gentile and becoming an onlooker to future moral evil. He finds the spiritual Israel self-definition of Christians a kind of cop-out, as he writes, an often self-deceiving universalist rhetoric. The inspiration for this interpretation, this new theodicy function of chosenness, a good deal of it comes from the Christian theologian Franklin Littell. I would be interested to see Yitz develop it a bit more here tonight. Thank you.
Don't want to take away my function as an introducer. Our second speaker this evening in what I was tempted to call our disputation is Irving Greenberg, who is, I'm sure, well known to all of us. He is an important teacher within the American Jewish community and a reflective thinker upon the modern Jewish experience. A rabbi and a historian, he is the director of the National Jewish Resource Center. Rabbi Greenberg.
I, like many of you in the audience, have read John Cuddihy's work with great profit. In particular, No Offense, which communicated, I think, better than almost any book I've read, the warning of how religions, I mean Protestantism and Catholicism as well as Judaism, are tempted or conditioned or trained to denature their fundamental claims for the sake of acceptance in American life, for the sake of being accepted into the civil religion, and under the impact or intimidation, perhaps, of the pluralism which is the characteristic reality of modern culture, which relativizes and privatizes all the claims that one makes. Of course, he warned of the high price of that conditioning, that in return for respectability or civility that all too often lapsed into simple manners, Jews, as Catholics and Protestants, were giving up absolutes which were scandalous, but which indeed were the core of what they stood for. And so I take that lesson, at least, as a warning against abandoning chosenness. Come back to that in a moment. Secondly, he warned of the pathology of what happens when Jews, in fact, do give up chosenness, a pathology which he described as a split between the outer and inner self, the outer self trying to act by the new manners and by the politeness which had to yield its claim, the inner self in some ways still believing, or at least still connected to the old idea, which led frequently to a further pathology, which was that the chosenness comes back in bastardized or hidden forms far more decadent than the original source. Thus, the characteristic Jewish way, secular, modern, deracinated Jewish way of presenting Jewish chosenness, namely Jews drink less, they don't beat their wives, they get educated more than the others, or all kinds of other variations, Jews' entrepreneurial roles in American society, their cultural role, their percentage that win Nobel Prizes, I could go on and on. He suggested that all these were examples of a kind of a hidden or covert superiority, which was in many ways a corruption of the original theological vision. I would agree with that point. In fact, I have come to reflect in recent years that it's worse than that. It becomes very close to racism, because once it is no longer linked to mission or purpose or function, all too often it becomes quite simply intrinsic, a claim not just to automatic superiority, but a kind of a built-in Jewish genetic endowment. I'm reminded of those Jews who reacted to the Sabra Shatila massacre by saying Jews could never do that. I'm happy to say, of course, that the Israeli army, as best we can tell, in fact, was not involved in that is to say, did not do it. But the claim that Jews could not do it strikes me as bordering on racism. It confuses the accident of history, that Jews, in fact, haven't done it, which in part is a product of the fact they were too weak to do it, with the claim that intrinsically Jews could, in fact, never do it. Well, there's nothing in the Bible or classic Jewish tradition that claims Jews can't do it, quite the opposite. The problem with Cuddihy's views, however, is, of course, that he has all along given us mixed messages. When one put down the book, as when one reflects upon his wonderful talk tonight, one asks oneself, was he warning the Jews of the cost of giving up chosenness? Or was he rather warning the Goyim that the Jews really secretly still believe in it and are using it to put them down? Was he warning the Jews that super-identification with Israel was an ersatz religious life, and therefore wrong? Or was he rather warning the United States that the Jews are really guilty of dual loyalty and must be checked? In this talk tonight, we have heard the continued ambiguous and, I think, profound critique which John offers us of this view. And I will start by saying that many of the errors that he points to, the covert forms of superiority, the pathology of the bastardized forms, I freely concede, and indeed, I feel he is simply carrying on a great prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition, of course, is the warning to Jews that they cannot confuse their chosenness with intrinsic righteousness or unearned superiority, to use the term that he quoted tonight. If I may use an analogy borrowed from Christian experience, a good Catholic priest friend of mine, in my earlier days when I was first coming out of the Orthodox and Jewish world, sheltered world, into ecumenical contact, we were once sitting around and I asked him in a moment of naive candor, I said, but what is it like? I mean, incredible to make a lifetime commitment to celibacy, to poverty. I mean, how is it possible? I mean, what an incredible commitment. What does it feel like to carry it every day? He looked at me and smiled and said, you know what it's like to be a Catholic priest? He says, in a moment of noble inspiration, you commit your whole life to Christ. He said, then you spend the rest of your life trying to get it back. That challenge of the fact that noble commitment or chosen calling is all too often years later turned into how do I make it back is a problem that the prophets saw very clearly. They understood that the Jews frequently confused the idea of chosenness with the fact that they were somehow intrinsically special. I refer, of course, to the warning in Deuteronomy that God did not choose the Jewish people because of their righteousness, nor because of their numbers, nor because of their wisdom. I refer to Jeremiah's warning to those Jews who thought that the temple was automatically guaranteed to survive because it was the house of the God, their God was the God of the world, and therefore it could not lose or could not be defeated. One could give many other such examples. But far from proving or disproving the concept of chosenness, it only proves the reality, which I think is one of the greatnesses of the idea, that it was given to human beings. The entire Jewish claim being that the Torah itself and Jewish tradition, as all religion, is given to human beings, with all the flaws and petty needs and petty limits of human beings, including the desire to make it back on the side once they've had to make the commitment up front. But that hardly disproves the concept. It only warns us where we have to look for the dangers of its abuse and where we have to have self-criticism. In short, I have come to the conclusion, whatever John's conclusion about it is, that I'm going to take him at the other side, as a warning of the dangers and costs of giving up chosenness. Indeed, I've come to the conclusion that, in fact, the choice between becoming truly democratic or even accepting full equality, which has been the major thrust why Jews have given up chosenness, or at least covertly or overtly rather given up chosenness, as against the choice of the pathological and hidden forms, as against the choice of assimilation. That these choices, which he pointed to tonight, arguing, of course, that this is a way of resisting assimilation and presumably something bad by that, I've come to the conclusion that whole set of choices is a false one. Or rather, to put it more accurately, those are the choices when we play by the rules of modernity and of modern culture. When we accept the ultimate or authority claims of modern culture, it tells us that the choice is universalism, in which we give up our own distinctiveness, or the chosenness, which is a form of arrogant superiority, or in its bastard forms, decadent. I would like to say that I, as a Jew, and I think more and more Jews, and I believe in this we are living as a paradigm for the world, I, as a Jew, and others no longer play or agree to play by the rules of modernity. And of course, the reason is that I live after the Holocaust and the rebirth of Israel. The first reality one must come to grips with is that the Holocaust is in some way a product of modernity, not simply a revolt against it. And upon reflecting upon it, while an important element was the technology, and an important element was the extraordinary concentration of power made possible by modernity, I would also like to suggest that an important part of it was the universalism of modern culture, a universalism which, when it is absolutized, leads not just to homogenization, but also, in its decadent or pathological form, to the total claim of a universal uniformity that must stamp out everything that disagrees or doesn't fit into the category, not least the Jews. And I came to see that in part this pathology expresses itself in the very method of the Holocaust. It was Raoul Hilberg and Christopher Browning and people like that, and Uwe Adam in German, who made me realize that it was bureaucracy, that classic expression of modern culture, the no exceptions, the establishing of universal categories that allow for no exceptions, that made possible simultaneously no exceptions for any Jew, or for Jews at all, and it made possible the setting up of the universal neutral, value-free categories that enabled the killing to be turned into a process, into a rule of law, in quotation marks, one which made no exceptions and was proud of its morality by being truly universal and making no such exceptions. It was Heinrich Himmler, in his classic demonic statement in Posen to the German officers, who said that contemptuously, that every German had agreed with the decision to kill the Jews, only each one came with his own private favorite Jew to exempt. But the SS and Himmler and men like him had had the courage to apply the category universally and reject those weak-kneed exceptions. And so I came to see that, in fact, the claim of universalism is so central in modern culture and so pathological in its absolute form that the most urgent question should be answered properly. Cuddihy posed to us the question, was pluralism a moral category, an insight into the genuine dignity of others, or was it in fact a kind of a pragmatic settlement in return for admission to the American scene? Was it, in short, a moral necessity, or was it a denaturing of classic religion? Well, my answer is, in light of the Holocaust, that clearly the great enemy is this kind of pathological universalism, and therefore the absolute overriding necessity, moral necessity, is to discover the reality of pluralism. Pluralism then is not an exercise in cleverness, showing that Reinhold Niebuhr was trading in profound Christian claims for respectability with New York Jewish intellectuals. Pluralism was the beginning of Niebuhr's struggling and difficult path of repentance and of conceding that the Jewish reality far eluded the Christian imperialist claims of the final revelation. And that brings me, therefore, to the second reason why I think chosenness has to be restated. Because, in fact, that pluralism, that universalism, which is indeed the enemy of chosenness, has been most seductive of all to Jews. If you point out that chosenness helps Jews resist the temptation of universal assimilation, let me point out that the overwhelming fact is that the majority of Jews in the modern period have chosen that assimilation. When the Philadelphia rabbi was asked, where are all the founders of a synagogue? Of course, they or their children now grace the roles of Quakers in Philadelphia. He said, some of my best Jews are friends. That has been the great temptation for Jews. I'm reminded of the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, somebody had a brilliant vision, a universal vision. It was a vision of one humanity, and that one humanity made possible by one language. As long as we had many languages, we divided from each other. And so this person had this brilliant idea, what if we invented a new language that truly would break all barriers? A language not only that would unify the world, it would be a language that would remove all the old stereotypes and all the old put-downs that put down outsiders and whoever members of our particular group. And so, of course, he invented this incredible language called Esperanto. And if I can make one commentary on that universalism that rejected chosenness of any language as well as of any people, the last great international gathering of Esperanto scholars was held in 1939. And it was held in Warsaw, Poland. Because the vast majority of Esperantists were, as you guessed, like the founder of Esperanto, Zamenhof, like the founder, they were all Jews, East European Jews at that, who were dreaming of joining the world. And of course, the reason that was the last great international gathering of Esperantists is that by 1945, over 65% of the delegates were dead. Most of them had died in the Warsaw Ghetto. There, as far as I'm concerned, is the shattering of the universal claim and the reality of chosenness. It is difficult to confront that. It doesn't fit the categories, and indeed it's a violation. But I'm reminded again of the Catholics in the Warsaw Ghetto. Did you know there was a Catholic church inside the Warsaw Ghetto? It consisted of people, for the most part, grandchildren of Jewish grandparents who had converted. They insisted they were true Catholics. They had been for a generation, in some cases 2 generations. They insisted that had nothing to do with the dirty Jews. They were good Poles. They were Polish patriots. And so they insisted on their own church and their own priest. I'm sorry to report the Nazis would not allow an Aryan priest to live inside the ghetto, but a Jewish convert to become a priest was found for them, and he served them. They insisted they'd have nothing to do with the other Jews, and so they insisted until the day they rounded them up and shipped them to Treblinka. Since I was not there, I will not comment on what they discovered when they got off the train, but I can guess. Or I'm reminded of Alexander Donat's biography, The Holocaust Kingdom, his diary, when he talks about why the Jews of Warsaw did not arise from the very first moment, even with bare hands, and attack the Nazis. And after going through many, many things, he finally concludes that the main factor was because, of course, Germany was to them the classic symbol of Western civilization, the classic symbol of law and order and culture. And he concludes, we fell victim to our faith in mankind, our belief that humanity sets limits to the inhumanity of others. Or I'm reminded of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the great liberal. What can I say? Franklin D. Roosevelt was a saint in my home. On the wall of my home was a picture of Franklin D. Roosevelt. After the war, when Roosevelt had died, I don't have time for this joke, I'm afraid. No. After the war, when Roosevelt had died, the Jews continued to vote Democratic in honor of Roosevelt. In 1945, the Republican Party in New York, desperate, finally decided to break the Jewish vote, which was the largest vote in the primary, and run a Jewish candidate because the Democrats nominated Bill O'Dwyer. They thought this was their chance to break the Jewish vote. So they ran Jonah Goldstein against Bill O'Dwyer. When the election results were in, the Jews had voted 95% for Bill O'Dwyer. The Republican chairman called in Goldstein and said, Goldstein, I don't understand this. He said, the Irish are all Democrats too, but if the Democrats run an Italian candidate and we pick an Irish candidate, we get 60% of the Irish vote because they're loyal. What happened here? We ran a Jew like you and he had 95% of the vote for O'Dwyer. He said, if that was your goal, it was totally wrong. It's not a matter of politics, it's a matter of religion. He said, what do you mean? He said, my Jews, they believe in drei Welten. That means three worlds. Die Welt, this world, jene Welt, the world to come, and Roosevelt. Now, why did they believe in Roosevelt? Because he was the president who, instead of saying during the Depression, it's all the Jews' fault, said we're all one. This is one coalition. This is one nation. Now the Jews are fully embraced. And he was the one who played to that desperate, what Arthur Hertzberg called that messianic Jewish need for acceptance. And if giving up the chosenness or distinct fate of Jews to get that was worth it, it was worth it. And so when the Jewish people came to FDR and asked him to bomb the rail lines, to single out the Jews for warning to Nazis who after were killing the Jews in a special way, the answer that came back was, this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. We have no right to ask for special Jewish needs, but when the war is saved for everybody, universal democracy, the Jews will naturally be taken care of as well. That is to say, the denial of chosenness, the insistence on universal democracy is the only moral principle for which one could fight a war. But of course, by the time the war was over, the Jews were taken care of, they were dead. And it took Martin Luther King, 15 years later, to have the courage to say there can be no universal democracy that does not recognize the givenness, the birth, the reality of my people's suffering that is distinctive and chosen and not the same as the others. But of course, King could not deny his black because it was part of his skin. But for the majority of the Jewish leadership, they still thought that they were white. Well, I'm not white, and that's what chosenness says. Chosenness says you're not white. It took the black insight to teach us that, but I'd like to think that more and more Americans are discovering that, and I'll come back to it in a moment. And the truth is that chosenness is an empirical statement at that. Once one removes the blinders, what the Holocaust did is not justify Jewish existence, nor is the chosenness needed to justify the Holocaust or to soften the blow. What it did was to remove the blinding glare of that sun of modernity that was so overwhelming that Jews could not hear. Like the siren's song, it was so sweet that Jews could never hear that they were crashing on the rocks. All it did was remove that blinder, and one confronts the empirical reality of the chosenness of the Jewish people. For what, in fact, does chosenness mean? If nothing else, it is a simple empirical statement about the reality of Jewish history and the role that Jews, in fact, have played in human history. One need not be a racist to recognize that this is a people which, out of proportion to its percentage, in fact, has played a role because it was singled out, and that's what chosenness means. Has played a role in educating the world and in shaping the world, unique for its own size, and I don't think that means putting down anybody else, and I'll come back to that a little later. What I'd like to suggest is when one plays by postmodern rules, one moves from what I've once written as from a Newtonian to an Einsteinian universe of truth. In the Newtonian universe, of course, there is only one absolute center. And anybody who claims to be the center must thereby put everybody else at the periphery. The power of the Einsteinian universe is that it recognizes there is no center, no absolute center in the world of the infinite, yet the claim of centrality is paradoxically more legitimate for the Earth if we recognize that we speak from the perspective of the observer. I suggest that that is indeed the uniqueness that chosenness is claiming, and that that uniqueness transcends the put down of the other. Now a comment about Hertzberg saying that chosenness is the fundamental claim of Judaism, all the rest is commentary. Of course, Jack makes a great deal of that also in his book. I would say that that is not so, that chosenness is not the fundamental claim. The fundamental claim of Judaism is redemption, that life is rooted in the divine, the transcendent, that human beings have already achieved the status of being the image of God, that is to say, of infinite value and unique and equal, and eventually all of life will be perfected to that dimension, and eventually the world itself will be restructured to respect, nurture, and uphold that dignity of infinite value of the image of God. What chosenness says is that the Jews have been singled out so far in history to play a role in achieving that end result. The main message is the result, not the Jewish people. And the Jews play that role in three ways. They teach that idea to the world, they model it in their own community, how we move toward that direction, and they work alongside others to achieve such a world. Now, of course, it can be abused in all the ways that John showed us this evening. But I would argue that empirically it's true. In history, Jews have played this role. The teacher through the Bible, as through the Talmud with its concept of law and covenant, as through Christianity and Islam, and indeed in the secularized and even bastardized forms such as Marxism. I would argue that the Jewish role is a model through the community, starting with the Bible and the individuals, and down to Israel today, which is a model, sometimes a bad model, sometimes a good model, but I like to think at all times a human model of what it is to struggle with nationality and dignity. The model idea then is empirical and not just projection. We're not dealing here with ideology, but objective empirical reality. And of course, the brilliance, I think, of Judaism's claim of chosenness is that God did not reveal an idea of truth, an idea of which there's only one truth. What is revealed is a process of redemption, an idea that can be realized step by step in the nitty-gritty of history. And the Jewish people, by carrying it, is an affirmation of humanness. The statement that a family or a people carries this idea, which is what chosenness says, then is in fact a human statement. It is an affirmation of the messiness of the human. If you look at the Bible, the people who are the carrier are Joseph and his brothers crazy and jealous of each other. It's David being carried away by the lust for Bathsheba. It's all the human fallibility, and yet it's the carriers of greatness, that very fallible human. It's the dignity of the human as against ideology. One is reminded of the Mao Zedongs and the Stalins who had to smash the family because the family is messy and it prevents the creation of the new human. Well, chosenness says the opposite. It says it's messy. It's odd of God to choose the Jews, but in fact, that's the affirmation of the humanity of this flawed people, which becomes a paradigm of the affirmation of all people's flawedness and humanness at the same time. And so this rediscovery of the chosenness, I believe, is the rediscovery of our own dignity and the affirmation of the humanness. Since I'm running out of time, let me just make one other general comment, and then I will save some for other comments. I've come to see that this is the profundity of the idea of chosenness. That without this idea, indeed the only choice is a universality in which we're all the same and all equal, but that means ultimately we're all the same because any difference becomes offensive to the others, and John is quick to point out some of the offense. The only other alternative is a kind of homogenization, but we all now know that that homogenization leads to totalitarianism and worse. It may start as democracy, but it ends up being totalitarian democracy. And therefore, in fact, the only serious alternative, I would argue, is chosenness. Chosenness means I am called. It's not an accident of birth, but it means I'm called to my mission or to my responsibility. It is a statement that truth is a relationship to God and a process of perfection, not a single-minded doctrine. If so, and here is my main post-Holocaust, post-modern refinement of chosenness, I would say that I think the ultimate falsity of the dilemma that Cuddihy poses for us is that the chosenness of the Jews need not deny the chosenness of others. On the contrary, I've come to see that it's precisely the genius of chosenness that more than one people can be chosen. The classic error of Christianity past was, of course, its belief that once they recognized their own experience of chosenness, they must have superseded Israel the Jewish people which preceded them, and so they had to put down the Jews, and so they created a theology of supersessionism and contempt, which indeed paved the way for the Holocaust. Just as Islam is tempted by its status as coming later to claim it supersedes Judaism and Christianity. But the point of chosenness is that God's love is the key element, and that exists for many children. If it's not too homely an analogy, many a child has had the experience of being the most loved child in the family, only when you talk to the family, you discover that each one has the experience of being the most loved child. And so I think the genius of the idea of chosenness is that the Jews too can misunderstand it, but I think that's the profundity of it. The Jews also thought that if they are chosen, they must deny the others. And so sometimes they put down Goyim and put down Christianity as some swindle. Who but a Goyish Yekub would believe that a woman could give virgin birth? I mean, that kind of language. I understand that. But of course, that kind of put down is only a pathetic need to wrap ourselves in the importance of our chosenness. The truth is that once we live in a post-Holocaust situation, we realize that those kinds of usages are ugly and demeaning, and in fact make us insensitive to the death of others. And so instead, in a post-Holocaust chosenness, it frees us to know Christianity as a messianic revival, as a messianic renewal, as a valid outgrowth of Judaism, as one that is close to the biblical tradition. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that Judaism does not go on with its experience of chosenness. In short, what I'm saying is that we now know that all ways must be explored, that if one goes the route of gospel, one gives up law. If one goes the route of law, one gives up some of the gospel. And therefore, we need each other to correct each other and to balance power. And therefore, there is no need for covert claims either. The deepest irony is that I have come to believe that the Jews living after the Holocaust are released from the experience of chosenness. If God cannot protect them after exposing them to this kind of murder, then surely the covenant cannot be imposed by chosenness. But clearly, overwhelmingly, the Jewish people has responded by reassuming that obligation. It becomes moot whether God chose them or they chose themselves. It is a statement of mission and of responsibility. That Jews step forward voluntarily. There is no threat greater than being a faithful Jew, because you expose yourself, your children, and your grandchildren to total murder. And yet Jews step forward and make that commitment to witness, to testify, and to work alongside the world. Is this a sellout? I think not. I would say the Jews stepping forward to work alongside the world affirm the humanity and the chosenness of others and call upon us, all of us together, to unite to perfect the world.
A fourth kind of Welt. After your talk, my paper, it took a beating. It's covered with Welts.
Oh.
I'd like to begin. I don't have very much to say. I think that was a good talk. I just have kind of a point, I don't know, a point of honor or something about the Jews who had converted to Christianity and Catholicism and were in the camps. And they had their own Jewish Christian priest and so on. And you said they, quote, insisted they had nothing to do with the other Jews. From what I have heard of those Jews who had become Christians in the camps, they didn't separate themselves in that way. You know, we want nothing to do with these. I mean, it makes the point that Hitler and Himmler, of course, had their Nuremberg standard that had nothing to do with belief or any change of religious allegiance, that was totally irrelevant to the Nuremberg definition of Jewishness. But you implied that individually they themselves were pushed off the ethnic Jews, the Jewish Jews. And I don't think there is any evidence of that yet. I mean, we know of some, like Edith Stein, who was Husserl's secretary, and she was sent to the camps, and she had no sense of separation or severance from her ethnic background, from her own group. Today we know the Jews for Jesus are proud of being Jews by birth. I've never found any evidence for that statement.
I think you've confused what I said. I wasn't referring to Jews who became Christians in the camps.
Not in the camps, went into the camps as Christians.
I see. Well, let me just say this. Of course, it's hard to generalize, and one could not make a universal statement. All the Jews who were Christian by self-definition, who were trapped in this net of the Holocaust. However, I would say the specific existence of that church, the answer is there is evidence, it's on the record, and the need and the insistence. That's number one.
That's another point.
And the claim as to why they had a need and a right to be separate. Secondly, there is a suggestive bit of evidence, and this is a little unfair, but I have to say it, and I'm not throwing this out as a universal condemnation of the Jews who converted. Quite a number, I would say a disproportionate number, of Jewish police heads of Jewish police, were in fact converts or children of converts, and including in the Warsaw Ghetto, including in Vilna Ghetto, and the reason is obvious, I think. For somebody to whom Jewishness means nothing, to now be trapped, singled out, and put to death for it is overwhelming and devastating. And there are two ways you can react. One way, of course, is to say, this is my fate as a Jew, let me at least affirm my dignity as a Jew. The second way is to internalize the hatred of the enemy and to turn it against other Jews. And I think that's what happened in these cases. Now, you, of course, pointed out before that Jews have a tendency to coin the term self-hate and malign or mislabel those who convert. I have come to feel that the consequences of my thinking about Christianity, that in fact it's a valid outgrowth of Judaism and a true vehicle of messianic redemption, that the consequence of that is if a Jew converts to Christianity, I do not automatically label them as a hater. I remember meeting John Osterreicher, who I had a very negative image of for many years because he had been engaged in missionary work, and coming to grips with the fact that John Osterreicher, who may have been in the earlier years, I think he was a self-hater, had come to be a passionate defender of Israel and a passionate defender of the Jewish people. I had to come to, it did shatter my easy image of all the converts and so on. Having said that, I think you don't do justice to the other side of the coin. It's very hard to be a minority. It's hard enough when you're a Jew totally wrapped in Jewish practice, Jewish observance, Jewish tradition. It becomes well nigh unbearable when you are deracinated from those things, and it's a very human tendency either to play the game by scoring one-upmanship. Yes, I'm nothing now, but you wait till we get to heaven and then you will light the fire for me. It's also very human to turn it into self-hate. In fact, there's lots of evidence not just among Jews, it's among Catholics. When they are a minority, it's among blacks, clearly. What about the black worship of white skin and straight hair for many years? I reminded my first experience at Brandeis, when Brandeis was a fascinating situation. The Jews were the majority, and they were all cracking up because they couldn't admit that they were the majority. They were trying to be non-sectarian. You know the famous joke about in the 19th century, you can always tell the Jewish organizations, they're the ones that are non-sectarian. Now, so Brandeis, they were trying to be non-sectarian, so they couldn't live with the fact that they were majority. On the other hand, the Protestant chaplain told me the Protestants were cracking up. Most of them came from small towns, because if they come from the big town, they wouldn't go to Brandeis, it's a Jewish school, but they didn't know any better. They came from these small towns, and for them all their life, the whole world was Protestant. And suddenly they were a small minority. He told me they were cracking up. They were coming to him, they wanted to change their name to Cohen. There was this girl who wanted to have an operation on her nose to make it crooked. I mean, it was unbelievable. They were denying to him. Well, the only healthy people, if you will, at Brandeis were the Catholics who were a minority from before and were accustomed to it. But the truth is that people, even when they're accustomed to it, find it very difficult to live by it. So again, I would say quite simply, I'm not trying to score points. If somebody converts, like Osterreicher I came to see, was a man with a passionate spiritual need who grew up in an assimilated home, empty of any values, and in the course of a search for religion discovered Christianity. Now, I wish Judaism had been offered to him. I'd like to believe, and I believe, it could have met all his spiritual needs. But if it couldn't, or if it didn't, I could have no quarrel with him as a genuine believing Christian. My quarrel with him was when he swallowed originally the Christian supersessionism, the Christian put down, and tried to either missionize or convert the Jews against their will. So I think we should stop scoring the points of whether Jews are using manipulative labels and confront the reality. The fact is that it's difficult, and many Jews, in fact, develop self-hatred.
Well, but my point, though, that it isn't a reality, that there's no social psychological evidence of this phenomenon of self-hate. In other words, there are other explanations of rhinoplastic surgery and so on, and why people do those things, which finds the hypothesis of self-hate supported.
I find this very humorous because I see the same claim, including self-hate, in black literature, for that matter, in Christian literature in minority countries. So I would argue that, we could argue this out further, I presume, but I would say that when somebody saves, well, again, I can use the simple analogy. At City College, when I was teaching, I used to look around and notice all the black girls with their Afro hairdos, and I surely envied them that reassertion of self when all the Jewish girls were saving their money to have their noses done. And I can't believe that that does not reflect some sense of discomfort, if not outright antagonism to one's own inheritance and one's own self.
Anyway, well, we agree to disagree on that one. Then the way you assimilate modernity, the great case of modernity is Hitler's Aryan racism. That's universalism gone mad, and so on, which is a potentiality of modernism. And I just think that's a little crazy. I mean, that's traditionally Hitler would be, Hegel would call it a concrete universal, not a universal. I mean, in a way that the Jews as a group are a concrete universal. That's why someone like George Steiner in this play that opened in Hartford makes an analogy between Hitler's Aryanism and Jewish chosenness, not because of their universalism, but because they universalize a particular, which is a very different thing from universalization per se. Well, do you want to?
Yeah, I would say, I think Steiner is a good example of how a deracinated Jew finally is driven to a kind of madness, which rather than confront the chosenness, ends up justifying Hitler as somehow being only the latest incarnation of the old biblical idea of chosenness. I'd say that that is, to me, the classic expression of blame yourself and your own people for being victims. And that's a classic example of what happens, both moral and intellectual collapse, when one has lost some of those roots, both of Jewishness and of chosenness. And there is a kind of a fascination with Hitler, which can easily become identification with him, and I think that in this case that's what happened, and I regret that very much for everybody's sake. Now, as far as why I say it quite so harshly, because I would say that the point I was making, the line, the Talmud says the line between heaven and hell is not thicker than a hair's breadth. Universalism, I think, is one of the most profound moral achievements of the 20th century, and I'm committed to it. But when it's absolutized, it takes pathological forms. If it doesn't take the extreme form of a Hitler situation, which is the attempt to achieve the ultimate universalization of Gleichschaltung, everybody becomes the same, then it takes much less, but equally bad, not equally, much less bad morally forms, but equally, I think, unhappy from mankind's point of view. It takes the form of the homogenization of culture. It takes the form of the blending of everybody into one. And it's precisely, I think, the achievement of chosenness that by its stubborn refusal to disappear, it affirms that the ultimate universal will be a collection of particulars and not one faceless mass. And I see that as the only serious moral and structural alternative to the otherwise inescapable homogenization going on around us. So far from the analogy to Hitler, I would say, I think that what Hitler represents is the attempt to achieve one universal category Aryan and kill off everybody else who doesn't fit the category. He started with the Jews because they are the leading contradiction to all those who claim absolute categories. I'm convinced to this day that anti-Semitism is the product not of everybody, it's a product of liberalism, of conservatism, of paganism, but not because all liberals or all pagans or all conservatives, but rather those conservatives and those liberals and those pagans and those Christians who make absolute claims for their categories, hate the Jews because they don't fit the category, because they deny the category by their very existence. For Christians who believe the final redemption is here, why are you still Jewish? For liberals who believe that liberalism is the final answer, why are you still Jewish? And so on down the line. Well, our answer is that by affirmation of our Jewishness, we continue to affirm that only the transcendent is infinite, ultimate, and everybody else is relative, including us. So that, I think, is precisely the point where Hitler goes pathological and where we offer an alternative. To make the analogy directly is to slide over from, I would say, it's like comparing the fin of a fish and the fin of an embryo. There may be some vague resemblance, but the attempt to slide over one to the other is an attempt to collapse distinctions, and I think ultimately to identify with the aggressor.
Third and final point.
Very briefly.
Your rediscovery of chosenness and so on today, I'm called to my mission, not by birth and so on in the old sense. I look on this as a kind of retooling of the old reform mission chosenness, which is fine, but it's the noblesse oblige chosenness in a way.
Can I give a very short response? A very short response. You say it's noblesse oblige. With all my criticism of modernity and, for that matter, of classical reform, it doesn't mean that there were never good insights or profound truths. I maintain that one of the great, profound human, moral, and spiritual truths of modernity is that it's forced us to face the universal categories, the true uniqueness of every group and every individual. That's the achievement. Now, the fact that those who try to reverse it into covertness and into covert superiority, as you say here, noblesse oblige. Let me tell you, it reminds me of the story of the rabbi, the chazan, and the shamash in the shul. You know the story. The rabbi and the cantor are the great rivals for influence and prestige, but the cantor and the shamash, the sexton, have their own rivalry too. The story goes on Yom Kippur, at the peak of the service, and everybody is really watching with great anxiety. The rabbi decides to top himself. He suddenly goes running forward, flings open the ark, throws himself down before the ark and says, "Lord, Lord, who am I to stand before you as the rabbi of this congregation? I am a nothing. I am posing as something, but I'm really nothing. I'm unworthy before you. I'm nothing, nothing, nothing." And he starts to weep. Well, you can imagine the whole congregation is just overwhelmed and touched and moved by the rabbi's extraordinary humility and greatness, and they're all looking bewildered, know what to do. But the cantor is not going to be left behind or left out by the rabbi. He goes running forward, he flings himself down on the ground in front of the ark and says, "Lord, who am I to pray as the cantor before you and to sing the songs of Israel before you? I am unworthy, I am a nothing, nothing, nothing." And he's crying. They're both lying on the ground, and the sexton all in the back realizes going on. He's not going to be left out. He comes running forward. As he comes running forward, the chazan, the cantor, nudges the rabbi and says, "Look who thinks he's also a nothing." To turn chosenness into some superiority is to try to say one is also a nothing. But in fact, what the tradition says is that I am nothing except a human being who carries an awesome responsibility with all my finite humanness, and that is my mission.
Okay, on that note, and as you all become visible to us up here for the first time, we'd like to turn the discussion and the debate over to the audience. Yes.
I found both of these speakers very stimulating, but something a little bit unreal about something that Rabbi Greenberg said, which I'd like some clarification about. It had to do with your remarks on universalism. It would strike me that the principal disease of the 20th century is rampant nationalism, that all people think they are superior. The Russians, the Americans, the British, the French, de Gaulle, the Germans, Hitler, and so on. I don't see that universalism has had much of a chance in this century. It looks to me as if people everywhere are ready to go to war because they believe that they are chosen or superior. And now one sees the same thing in the Middle East. I mean, the Palestinians and the Israelis are nationalists. I don't see the universalism that you're talking about anywhere.
Well, I'm offering a paradoxical position, if I may say so. Yes, first of all, choose your poison. I don't deny that nationalism and various forms of particularism run riot are also dangerous and also ugly. It's entirely possible. That's true. So each one of us clutches at our particular proof as to what's wrong and how we're right, but the other position is wrong. The truth is that universalism has dangers and particularism has dangers. However, if I have to choose, and that was the point I was making, as dangerous as nationalism is, or as group particularism is, when a particular nationality or group makes excessive claims, it automatically brings into play countervailing forces. When Russia tries to expand its power to control the world, it automatically brings to play countervailing forces like America, like other groups, and so on. But when you come in the name of universalism, you eventually abolish the countervailing forces on the grounds that since we're universal, there's no room for these exceptions. That's why, with all the obloquy that it has attracted, the distinction between totalitarian and authoritarian is a correct one. The totalitarian is a universalism, and therefore it makes the claim the right to abolish family and labor unions and religion, because for a true democracy we have to eliminate all these special privileges and special favoritism and achieve a true universalism. So my concern is that the dangerous metastasis or cancer of modernity, the most dangerous of all, I think, is universalism when it goes riot. A universalism properly checked, on the other hand, is healthy, moral, and important breakthrough, because now we begin to feel through the universal responsibility for each other. Therefore, my argument was that chosenness is a check upon universalism, not a substitute for it. It's a necessary check, because out of chosenness can come a universalism of many plural positions, rather than the alternative, which is a universalism that denies everything. But these universals have been enormously powerful, and therefore highly dangerous to human beings and other living things.
It seems to me that the term chosen in and not exclusionary in this chosen feature, that others too can be chosen and can follow in their own, perhaps equal development or tangential development. Why not get rid of that term chosen? I think it does more harm than good.
Well, the term chosen, or bechira in Hebrew, simply means an act of choosing, and I see no reason why that act cannot be repeated again and again and again. And I think it's true that there were Jews in the course of history who, in good faith or out of covert psychological needs or out of pathetic inability to live with their own suffering, were forced to say, we are chosen, the rest of you are nothing. But my point is that as we reflect, and we've learned something, I hope, from the modern world, from its universalism, and its challenge to Jewish excessive particularity, and from the postmodern world and the Holocaust experience, the importance of putting limits on chosenness as in putting limits on universalism. Now you're saying, why not drop the term to avoid all that antagonism? Well, I think the antagonism is earned only when the counter group assumes its own superiority and its own universal claim, and therefore is offended this group wants to go on being itself. If I personally feel comfortable with my own reality, I find no offense in somebody else either being chosen or, for that matter, making even superiority claims to themselves. I'm not offended by it. I think the offense against the Jews has been the anger at the discomfort of feeling that I'm not comfortable with what I am, and I need everybody to admit what I am is the only or the ultimate category, and since the Jews are denying it by their continued stubborn existence, so my point is I don't drop my terms because somebody else is being an absolutist and finds my very use of the term offensive. I'm prepared to phrase it as positively as I can. If someone comes to me with a better term that will lead the Jews to the proper application of chosenness, I would welcome it. But in the absence of that term, I think the offense, the stumbling block, the scandal is an important part of the reality, and I'm prepared to face it because I think that's the moral litmus test for society. When they come to accept it without being offended, that's a sign that, like America, it's moving toward true pluralism and toward a healthy democracy, which in the long run is good for everybody, including Jews.
I'd like to make a brief observation and ask Professor Cuddihy to comment on it. In our liturgy, we don't read what Solomon ben Maimon wrote. We read the Aleinu prayer, which the rabbi can correct me on this, but I think it's probably our oldest prayer. And it says, thank God that we were not made like other people, and thank God that our lot is not the same as theirs. However, we look forward to the day when everybody will acknowledge God's rules. It doesn't say become Jews, God's rules, and know that He rules the earth. And as I see it, the first part of it is a very healthy psychological tool to enable Jews to keep apart from groups that were not civilized among whom they lived. However, as Jews live among people who are civilized, we don't think we're the only civilized people, and we look forward to the day when there'll be more and more civilized people. And we've never claimed that we're the only ones who will go to heaven or be saved. So I think the Aleinu prayer is a far more authentic statement of how we Jews feel than what Solomon ben Maimon wrote.
Well, I guess you know the long history of the problem of the prayer book and what Reform did with it, and the nationalistic references, and finally Mordecai Kaplan, the left wing of conservative Jewry, just threw it out altogether and said we just can't revamp it. I think what I have said here applies mutatis mutandis to the prayer book also.
I'd like to make one historical point that you seem to be confused about and ask you a question. You asked about the Jewish Christians, or whatever you want to call them, who distance themselves from the ethnic Jews. The verification is to be found in almost any textbook, and I would enjoin you to read Karl Dietrich Rothko's The German Dictatorship. They tried desperately to get themselves, the Christians, certified pure Kashrut Christians. The question I would ask you is this. You mentioned some of the mechanisms by which Jews, retard assimilation. The question is, assimilate to what?
I'm sorry to say, I was still thinking of your first point, and I wasn't listening to your second.
Well,
So,
you respond to my first point, if you want.
so just the first point. What I was objecting to there was actually a usage of words, but the phrase that Yitz used was they insisted they had nothing to do with other Jews. And I felt that this was like a social thing, not that they were kosher Christians in that sense. They knew that, and they would try to get whatever they could that was due, to that, and get out of what they could get out of. I'm not saying they were saints. That isn't my point. My point is this kind of ethnic separatism I heard in that phrase that he used, and I don't think there's any evidence of that. They'd say, of course we're Jews. My mother was a Jew, my grandparents, or something like that, or I'm half a Jew, or an eighth, or whatever.
No, of course, we're Christians. We are practicing Christians.
Yes, in the sense that is our defining identity, yes. I'm not sure whether this is a matter of words or evidence or history. Pardon?
You're making too much of the word. The fact that they consider themselves believing Christians, and they try desperately to get the authorities to recognize that.
The religious variable as the dominant one, right? I don't think, anyway, I don't think that means they had nothing to do with other Jews.
Yeah, okay. I think we can continue this
I think
debate.
we're in what the lawyers call de minimis at this point.
My question is this. You mentioned before the various mechanisms by which Jews retard assimilation.
I quoted Marshall Sklar on that, and chosen-ness as a retarding mechanism.
My question to you is, assimilate to what?
To the American identity, the normative central identity of the WASP. Read my book. It's in no offense, and each of these religions have struggled with this normative American generalized identity. It's the thing Yitz is talking about, too.
Okay.
Ask him what it means.
We're going to take one more question now, and we can continue the discussion after we break up the formal part of the program. Back there. Would you stand up, please? It's
Talk
very
a little
difficult
louder.
to hear you.
Please talk a little louder.
That's too.
I don't think so. I'm just going to read you one passage in conclusion. What I am concerned with is what this becomes. Philip Roth. What a Jewish child inherited, Roth writes, was no body of law, no body of learning, and no language, and finally no Lord, which seems to me a significant thing to be missing. But what he did receive was a psychology, not a culture and not a history in its totality. What one received whole, however, what one feels whole, is a kind of psychology, and the psychology can be translated into 3 words: Jews are better. This is what I knew from the beginning. Somehow, Jews were better. I am saying this as a point of psychology. I am not pronouncing it as a fact. So one had to then, I think, begin to create a moral character for oneself. That is, one had to invent a Jew. There was a sense of specialness, and from then on, it was up to you to invent your specialness. to invent, as it were, your betterness, invent a character for yourself, or invent certain moral responses, invent attitudes. There was, I think, for example, in Jewish writers, that striving and yearning to be special. The blessing and burden of having been brought up in America, in contrast to Israel, was to have been given a psychology without a content, or with only the remains of a content, and then to invent off that.
I would put it this way. I think the substance of the word chosenness and its original sources is birth, the fact that being born a Jew carries a major message and freight with it, and I think that's self-evidently true. That is to say that the Jewish people have had to pay the penalty negatively, but also positively have carried the message even when they weren't conscious of it. Secondly, it was the statement of a special role in history, and again, I argue empirically that's in fact what happened. Thirdly, it's a statement of humanness, that human beings are called to be carriers of a message. They are not simply, it's not a pure ideological message that is independent, untouched by human hands, that the human beings in their very flawed nature are called to carry it. Now, Roth's racism, or all the other racisms, I would like to almost defend them to this extent, that they are dim attempts by people who've forgotten the original message, like the old Hasidic story. I don't know the place in the forest, I don't know the story, I don't know what to say, and yet somehow in the back of me I still have some memory that there's something important going on here. And I think they were right. What I'm arguing is that now we no longer need be Moranos, we no longer need be respectable by American standards, by contemporary modern standards so-called, and release the chosenness, but rather chosenness meant to be called to make life special. John, I would say to you, instead of trying to persuade us to give it up, don't fight it. I suggest join it at least with your group and help us do it together.
Just want to, do I have a microphone? Yeah, you do. Just want to say, for those of you for whom this is the first opportunity to hear Yitz Greenberg, as one who has studied with him on occasion, he is truly one of the great teachers of the American Jewish community. And if this has been a foreshbite, if this has been an introduction, you can spend 6.5 hours on a wonderful subject, which is a survey of Jewish theology and Jewish thought in many ways, this Sunday in our first all-day institute. Let me just say, now that we've resolved the issue of chosenness, next Tuesday evening, two of the most seminal thinkers on the field of ethnicity, Harold Isaacs, professor of political science emeritus at MIT, and one of the frontier thinkers on the subject of ethnicity, will join with Irving Levine, the director of the Institute for Pluralism and Group Identity of the American Jewish Committee. It will be an extraordinary evening, and I hope you will join us. Let me please really thank Yitz Greenberg and John Cuddihy. This has been an extraordinary evening, and Paula Hyman, our moderator. Coffee and tea is being served in the rear lounge. Please join us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.